Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pocket Size Bio with Dr. Casco. In this video, we're going to talk about Chapter 14, Pathogen Management Strategies. And this is the last chapter for the Nelson Waste Biology textbook. And this would essentially cover the last remaining topics for Year 12, Unit 4 of the WACE program. Okay. And this topic, in this chapter, we'll talk about strategies that have been implemented in Australia and worldwide to manage the spread of pathogens. Okay, so we're going to get into chapter 14, section 1. Of course, why do we need to manage, right, the spread of disease, right? And why do we need to implement pathogen management strategies, right? So for a number of reasons, right? We know that there has been a incline, right? An increase, right, in emerging diseases over um, many years, right? The spread of transmission has increased and even become more efficient for many viruses and other pathogens, right? And even distribution of familiar diseases and repeating diseases that come about at a yearly basis, right? So all of these things has increased relatively rapidly in a short period of time, right? Last decades, if we were to really compare it to the whole time of modern civilization, right? And one of the main things that it has, you know, um, been responsible for this is the idea of low cost flight, right? Cheap flights, right? Low cost international flights has greatly had a correlation with outbreaks and global incidences, right? Of different pathogens, right? So, these emerging diseases, because of this idea of spread and globalization, can be broken down generally into three categories, right? You have, diseases that recently appear in a population, right? You have diseases that occur previously, right? But only until recently um has their presence been affecting, right, small populations in isolated places, so their spread has become more effective, right? And diseases that have occurred previously, but um, they've been associated with a newly identified pathogen, right, or a strain. Okay, so some examples of these emerging diseases are COVID-19, right? Of course, we just all experienced, right? The Ebola virus, AIDS, right? Malaria and tuberculosis. And all of this kind of requires scientists, epidemiologists, right? Medical doctors, health scientists, right? To find a way to manage the spread, right? And what does that entail? That entails a lot of research. That entails a lot of experiments and communication and collaboration between scientists all over the world, right? Different countries and organizations and communities, right? All need to collaborate really to get a sense on how to keep under control the spread of different diseases that we have occurring, right? So, definitely there's a need for management strategies, right? It's critical, right? Or else we're going to be having pandemics all over you know, pandemics all over all the time, right? So we need strategies, right, to manage the spread of disease. Okay, just go a little bit down. So, um, yeah, so how we go on about to do that is, different forms of strategies, right? Interventions that we can figure out that can later be designed to target anything to help prevent the spread of disease. It could be vaccines, it could be preventive measures, right? and so forth to enable to mitigate this whole um, um, a particular disease to become a pandemic, right? So, definitely one thing that scientists have to study is the life cycle of the pathogen that is being spread out, right? Life cycles of pathogens can help scientists to work out how to prevent and control, right? Those are you're going to hear this word a lot, right? Preventing and controlling the spread of disease. Okay. Um, and how do you study that? Basically, the mode of transmission. How does the mechanism of transmission work, right? Any influence of environmental factors that um, are helping enhance the spread of disease, and the characteristics of the infected population, right? Are they those infected individuals? How are their levels of immunity, right? Things like that. So um, ultimately, you study all of these together, and you can create a disease management strategy, right, to control, right, a, a spread of disease, right? A lot of coordination. It's a coordinated response to involve prevention, control, and treatment. And it's very specific. Of course, it has to be very specific to a particular disease. Okay. So as we take a look at different pathogens, one of the most important ways is prevention and early detection. That is goes without saying. You must be able to detect early and prevent, right? To try to ease the spread of disease, right? So it's one of the most effective strategies. Okay. And we're going to take a look at very specific examples on how to do that. All right. So, um, we also will take a look at some specifics, right? Viruses that have no vaccines, right? How do you prevent that, right? Novel viruses that are coming out, right? If you don't have a vaccine to kind of um, um, be able to have some fight against it, then prevention is what's important, right? Prevention will stop transmission, um, where you have signs and symptoms that are detectable, that are being noticeable in the population. Okay. And what are some prevention practices and measures, right? Washing hands, having good health services available, quick services available, right? And definitely using mathematical modeling, computer modeling to see the trend of a spread, right? Different areas around the world. What are the numbers, right? What is the data showing in terms of spread? Okay. Some things we're going to take a look at in this chapter are practices that prevent spread, more specifically, right? Quarantine, vaccination, public health campaigns, awareness, right? Pesticides, genetic engineering, right? And ultimately, you want to prevent the spread, right? Related to that are control measures, right? What does the government policies implement to help reduce the number of incidences, right? Or duration of the disease, right? So these are referred to as control measures, right? There's strategies that can help the whole population kind of lower the spread of disease. Okay. Um, Ultimately, you want to reach a level that you can eradicate, right? Basically make the whole disease disappear, right? This is referred to as eradication. All right. So we're going to take a look at that. Okay. So there's a little bit of context again, right? In terms of strategies, right? These management strategies, they involve very, very meticulous studies, right? And a rapid response to outbreaks, right? And this has to occur at many different levels of a country, right? Of the world, right? At a community level, at a local level, right? At a state level, at a whole country level, in order for a certain disease to really get eradicated, right? We've seen this idea of border control with pesticides, right, and invasive species, but Australia, and not just Australia, but referring to AU, it does have a strict border control, and you want to implement quarantine strategies, right? Why? Ultimately, to limit an outbreak, right? You want to control and keep under extreme conditions, right? What is the source of the pathogen, right? Or keep us a certain level of pathogens under control, right? The World Health Organization has a whole response team that is, tasked, if I can say, right, or aimed at prevention, right? Once the outbreak has happened, we want to lower the incidence rate, anticipation, right? Early detection, containment, control, eradication, right? So it's very, very important, early detection, right? So you can subsequently contain, control, and eradicate, right? So, um, when you have a certain, disease that is spreading, you have to have some sort, or you want to implement treatment strategies, right? And that could be a several, a myriad of things, but it does involve healthcare, right? You want to have these healthcare provisions, providing medication to the population, vaccination quickly as fast as possible, right? And hopefully affordable, right? As much as it can be, right? To be spread throughout the whole area, right? And then ultimately, when you have all these strategies together, if the host doesn't have any symptoms present or any pathogens present, then you basically are said to be cured when you don't have the pathogen anymore, right? And yeah, you have certain epidemics that have good control over, yearly disease, if I can say, or um, an example is influenza, right? It reoccurs yearly and yearly and yearly, right? And it's just a matter of, getting your booster shots and try to avoid a high outbreak, right? It still remains a threat, like I mentioned before, because influenza is a virus, and viruses are subject to rapid changes in their DNA, right? So what could work doesn't work anymore, or isn't as efficient. So scientists have to be creating um, improved, right, or up to date vaccines, right? Okay, and of course, tuberculosis also. We have this situation where it's becoming resistant to antibiotics, right? Remember, tuberculosis comes from a bacteria, right? Um, and unfortunately, a lot of people can't afford that, right? So you do need some financial help to ultimately eradicate a certain disease that's prevailing, right? Or is on the verge of prevailing. Okay. So this whole study of spread of disease and mitigating and controlling and treatment, right, and prevention is essentially the study of epidemiology, right? You've probably heard that I've been saying this word a couple of times, right? Epidemiology is a study of biology, right, that um involves, right, studying the occurrence of disease in populations, right? And those scientists that study epidemiology are referred to as epidemiologists, right? They're professionals that work to prevent and minimize the impact of disease in the population, right? So what are some things that you could do as an epidemiologist, right? You could identify outbreaks, right? You can analyze data to see the effectiveness of a vaccine, right? You could calculate cost effectiveness of certain means of the certain strategies. Are there certain strategies that are not working, right? Um, and so forth, right? So you essentially, you act as a data scientist, as a biologist, even detective work you have to do, because scientists basically have to track down causes of this emerging diseases, right? What is the reservoir host? Who are the susceptible hosts? How is the mode of transmission occurring? And so forth and so forth. So you try to calculate and see patterns, right, of disease, identify, narrow down on what is the underlying cause, and how do you provide, how can you create a management strategy to try to avoid future outbreaks and try to prevent more spread, right? So it's very interesting how epidemiology works, right? And we're going to take a look at some, parts of epidemiology within the scope of this book, of the WACE program, right? So they analyze data. One thing is critical is analyzing data, right? To see, if there's any communicable disease, and if it's diagnosed, it has to be reported. And that information that gets reported by doctors is what epidemiologists can use and analyze, right? Okay. In 2018, you had some, emergence of certain infectious diseases in Perth, right? Definitely, you're seeing them all over the world, but focusing on Australia, STDs, measles, influenza, varicella viruses, right? STDs means sexually transmitted diseases, right? Um, to try to mitigate, right? Try to lessen how the spread is occurring, right? Tuberculosis, if you take a look at this little graph here, right, you have some infectious diseases that have not been eradicated. Like I mentioned before, right, even after hundreds of years of infection, right, tuberculosis is the leading one, right? Cholera, you have AIDS. If you take a look, AIDS nowadays has been really, really reduced, right? Influenza, malaria, smallpox, um, and so forth and so forth, right? So we want to get this kind of down in terms of so this little circle chart is showing the volume, right, of deaths, right? Okay. There's a picture that you see here in the textbook. It's basically a person infected with smallpox. This is a very intense case where you're having, um, you know, now you hardly don't see this anymore because of vaccination, right? And essentially being eliminated since the 1980s, smallpox, right? Okay, go to the next page here. All right, so let's get into um, um, section 14.2. Where's my video? Here. Okay, so I guess I have to leave it like this. Um, uh, strategies, right? Strategies that control the spread of pathogens. Okay. So the first one that we've talked about it before in terms of invasive species and in terms of infecting individuals, um, is quarantining, right? What is quarantining? We've all experienced it before. We've seen it during COVID, and it's essentially a period of isolation, right? Period of isolation that is undertaken by potentially infected individuals to prevent the spread of a contagious disease. All right. So you're isolated from a susceptible population, pretty much the population, right? Until the period of incubation is finished. And that will show you, hey, I've surpassed the period of incubation. I feel fine. Um, Most likely I'm not infected. Incubation period has finished. Either that or you have been infected, you are an infected individual. Maybe the signs and the symptoms have passed completely and you get negative test results, right? So you're isolated in this situation by these criteria until you're feeling good, right? Until you're cured again. Generally the case, right? And Australia does have strict quarantining laws, right? That also not just humans, but they're heavily regulated in terms of any items that can carry an infected individual, animal, right, in organism or plant disease, right? And this is especially true for chytridiomycosis, right? And amphibians, right? Heavily regulated, right? And the reason for that, of course, is that you can be carrying pathogens, right? And not just that, but products themselves could be carrying pathogens, right? If you have very contaminated products, livestock products, produce, et cetera, that could quickly propagate itself throughout the country, right? So biosecurity is basically a notion that has been implemented, which is a set of strategies to support prevention, right? Prevention and responding to any form of disease that has been, um, um, coming in the country, right? So, and of course, if it has come in, we need that kind of aspect of recovery from disease that can influence more specifically economy, environment, and health, right? So this idea of biosecurity aims to maintain, right, a disease-free status for many diseases, many world diseases, right? So having this idea of biosecurity does help prevent, right? In terms of Australia, graphical isolation has played a very good role in um maintaining, Australia's status of being, um disease free, if I can say, for several pathogens, right? But as you do get globalized and you're getting, individuals flying in and moving out and coming back, you kind of lower this idea of graphical isolation, right? Okay. So in terms of agriculture and produce and livestock, there's heavy screening, right? Um, Especially when you're bringing foreign species, right? Exotic pests, diseases, right, are always looked at when you're bringing any type of essentially anything coming in, right, to the country. People, parcels, mail, packages, baggage, ships, right, that are containing those big, material containers, right? Animals, plants, all of these things are surveillance heavily, right? X-ray machines, physical surveillance, even um, um, other organism detection, like dogs. They can scent certain pesticides, certain pests, certain aromas of plants, and so forth, right? So they don't get inside. Okay. So biosecurity, very, very important. Very, very important. All right. And not just for the sickness that it can bring and devastate a population, but again, finance, right? Economy, right? If a harmful disease gets into AU, they can cause a lot of financial loss for many industries, right? Especially agriculture, right? You can see that happening with the swine fever, right? That killed that basically, you know, devastated populations of pigs, right? So yeah, finance is very, very important, right? Especially in agriculture. And that whole idea of trying to maintain, surveillance is also a thing that also requires income, right? It's also costly to attempt to bring disease under control once it has entered. So prevention is very, very important, right? Of course, preventing and the idea of quarantining is much, much cheaper. You just get the individual, chunk them into a room. It's much easier than providing constant medicine and medicine and medicine. Disease gets passed on to other individuals, then you have to provide healthcare for that. So uh, the cost of quarantine is much, much easier, right? Um, Yeah. So in 2020, March 2020, COVID-19 was declared a pandemic in the World Health Organization. If you guys remember during those days, it was pretty rough, right? Um, People arriving from AU overseas were subject to mandatory quarantine for 14 days, right? Not just Australia, but we would see that all over the world, right? Quarantine was mandatory. Once you arrived, they book you in a hotel. You had to stay in the hotel or home quarantining, depending on the time of COVID, right? It started to become much less, right? And people would come and they'll take a look. Are you still sick? Right? Or are you having certain symptoms still, right? Before you can get okay to leave, right? In Japan also, we were having quarantine, of course, right? So quarantining, very, very important. The book has some very nice kind of details in terms of measurements, right? To protect Australia's agriculture, right? Agriculture industry and environment against an influx of disease-carrying materials and organisms, measures were undertaken, right? In terms of agriculture, right? Inspection of all material. I'm going to highlight this because it's important to know, right? Um, that was brought into Australia. Why can't I draw? Let me get my pen here. Inspection of all material need to be um, uh, surveillance, right? Inspected, right? Any kind of shady material would get confiscated, right? Like I mentioned before, um, plant material, other animals, right? They could easily get taken away from you, right? If they're suspected of being sick, right? Um, if you guys remember the varroamite of the bee diseases, right? That is a vector, right? Very, very important to be seen or to be detected, right? You want to eliminate any type of pest coming into the country, right? Um, and so forth and so forth. And even tools, right? Machinery coming in needs to be treated, sprayed with an anti-infectious agents, right? Before they can actually come in, right? Especially agricultural tools, right? As you guys remember, even tires can infect and spread disease, right? So Western Australia has remained relatively free of pests, right? And disease, right? In 2020, there was the Queensland fruit fly, right? Was basically uh, um, found, which was a serious pest that was detected. The larvae can develop within the fruit and the feed, right, for livestock, and uh, within the fruit and feed, basically grow. Adults would emerge and infect other fruits to lay eggs, right? So this was a pest that would pass down to different fruits relatively fast, right? So, um, how would you manage that, right? How would you manage that? So, by setting quarantines where you would have a certain kind of trap system, you would you would make them, come to where you want them to go and essentially quarantine them, right? So, very, very important to um, inspect, which will lead to an avoidance, right? Prevention of a certain a vector coming in or even the pathogen itself coming in, right? Like I mentioned before, right? I'm pretty much not going to highlight this. New or used machinery, animals or animal products, bees, very important. Bees, we've seen how infected bees can just pass down all those bee diseases as we talked about, right? Um, Fomites, right? Animal feed, right? Of plant origin, um, processed foods, right? Plants or plant products, seeds, litter, plant material, even soil. Remember, soil-borne pathogens can even pass down things, right? Containers, large agricultural containers in general can pass down material, right? So make sure you know specifically some examples of potential carriers. Okay. I'm going to highlight that there. All right. Good. Next one is immunization and herd immunity. So this deals more with your immune system, right? And here you're let me just zoom in. What's happening here, right, is basically you're kicking up you're starting up your whole defense system of your own body, right? And immunization is basically it's the act, the process of protecting someone from disease, right, by the use of vaccines, right? Of basically vaccination. Okay. Ultimately, you want to develop a resistance to a particular disease by creating antibodies. Okay. And vaccinations, they stimulate something called active immunity. Okay. Active immunity means that your body, your immune system, right, is producing antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that can come in and actually fight and neutralize a certain pathogen, right? Um, and this happens with our different types of immune cells, right? We have some immune cells that are called memory cells that can basically analyze a pathogen or the pathogen from a vaccine, create a complement structure that can bind to that pathogen, right? And then the pathogen gets pretty much nullified or um, it can get tagged to be eaten by macrophages and so forth. So if the pathogen gets um, basically controlled, then you don't risk getting an infection, right? So the production of antibodies, okay? An antibody, when is it formed? It's usually formed in a susceptible host during its response to a specific pathogen. And if you get a vaccination, you're basically injecting a weak form of a certain pathogen, like a virus, like COVID, right? So this is referred to as active immunity. We're boosting up our own immune system, right? Then you have serum type vaccines that these are type of passive immunity. And you basically, in a nutshell, you're collecting antibodies from other people and you're injecting them to you, right? Or from animals. You can also produce antibodies from animals, they inject them to you. And through a basically a blood transfusion, you're passing it to your own body, but that is temporary, right? It's not like having your own um um your own immune system, right? And this is basically active immunity. You have your natural own immunity, you get infected, fully infected, and your body will produce the antibodies. Or you can get a vaccination. This is referred to as artificial, where you jumpstart the immune system by having a weak version of the virus or pathogen, right? Passive, you're basically getting it. You can get it by like a blood transfusion, or you can also get it by naturally by the mother passing her antibodies to the child. Okay. So it's generally temporary, right? Then the baby will start producing its own immune system, right? In general, make sure you understand what are antibodies, right? Why can't I highlight this? There you go. Antibodies are proteins, right? They're produced by white blood cells, and there's different type of white blood cells, right? Memory B cells and T cells and so forth. But just know that they're part of the white blood cells. Okay. So essentially, like I was mentioning, these antibodies, they can bind to pathogens, and then they'll make them harmless, right? They're also known, you probably have heard of this word, immunoglobulins. This is the scientific term for antibodies, right? And they're produced by specific type of white blood cells that are referred to as B cells. Okay? Memory B cells. Okay? All right. So, and then the whole concept of a vaccine and a vaccination, right? You do need to know this, right? Is the administration of a vaccine into the bloodstream, right? To cause immunity, right? So it's making you jumpstart your immune system. Usually vaccinations by injection, right? So what happens is that, again, the vaccine stimulates your immune system and your immune system will recognize the disease. And once you recognize a disease and you produce antibodies, those antibodies stay with you forever, right? So when you get infected by the real thing, it's not going to hurt you or not going to cause such a um, intense symptoms to you because you're already protected from it, right? So you're already immune to it. Okay, that's the whole concept of a vaccination. All right. So vaccines help develop immunity by inducing a response to part of a pathogen. Okay. To some chunk of a pathogen, right? If it's a virus, let's say the little protein coat of the virus, right? These little proteins, right? The antibody can come in and bind to these protein coats. All right. Any part of a pathogen is referred to as a antigen. Okay. Antibody generating. Uh, uh. Okay. So you trigger a response to produce these antibodies, and you can produce, that immune system. Generally, the vaccines that we get, the pathogen is either dead completely or severely weakened. That it's the scientists have removed any factor, could be in the genes, could be on the protein code, that actually causes the disease in your body, right? So let's say you have a little virus here, and let's say that these little red little kind of pyramid things are the virulent factors. They would remove that. So that's what it means to be attenuated, to be weakened, right? So um, once you get immune, right, you could still get some symptoms, but you won't get the full intense symptoms as if you were getting it the first time, right? So um, by having these B cells and reading, right, analyzing the antigen, right, you will produce a defense, right, against the pathogen. All right. Now, these little pictures you see here, you do not need to know. Okay. I just wanted to show you what an antibody kind of looks like, right? They basically would bind to some receptor specific to a part of a pathogen. Okay. All right. So again, like I mentioned before, vaccines contain they could contain a dead, weakened, or inactive form of the pathogen, right? Some examples of what that means is basically the DNA or RNA is removed, right? That prevents the viruses from replicating, but you can still have the physical viruses there, right? So that the body can register and read, right? If the viruses then comes in and infects you for real, right? Okay. So in a nutshell, if the antigen components can they stimulate an immune response, but not disease symptoms, then that is basically immunization, right? If you're able to get your immune system to create antibodies and you don't get symptoms and you don't get the disease, then that is a success story, basically. Okay, because you'll be prevented now from future infections, right? So basically, these are your little immune cells, and they're looking for this particular antibody. And this guy's kind of speculating, is this guy really the guy? And then kill him. All right. And then we get herd immunity, right? Herd immunity is basically, okay, I mentioned this before. Okay. Um, it's when, you get many people in a community or in a population that are immune to a contagious disease, right? They become immune to a contagious disease. And by being immune, you basically can slow down or stop the spreading of the disease because they've been immunized generally, right? They've been immunized. This is referred to as herd immunity. So the more people get vaccinated, the herd immunity efficiency gets higher, right? When there's a threshold that is being met, those that aren't immune will still get protection just because the virus can't jump relatively easily from all those immune people, right? So the chances of spread decreases, right? An example of this is measles, right? Okay. Um, Again, occurs more if it's a contagious disease. It doesn't work on all diseases like tetanus because they don't spread from human to human, right? It's not communicable. It's not contagious. All right. So you do need to know the principles of herd immunity. It's pretty much what is here. So make sure you understand it, you read it, right? You know the critical parts, right? Um, what essentially happens is that when there's a high level of individuals in a population that becomes immune, right? By you could get it naturally, right? But artificial vaccine, so vaccination, right? That has kicked in, and remember during COVID, everyone was being asked to get your your immune vaccination, right? This will kick and jump start your immune system, and then more individuals get infected. Sorry, more individuals would get protected, right? And naturally, right? I want to say and naturally, um, and after they've recovered from the disease, they're part of this population now, of course, because you have your immune cells that are acting against a certain disease there, right? This will limit the spread of the disease, okay? Because now, since more people have the immunity toward a certain pathogen, it's going to jump less to those susceptible individuals, okay? Good. So infected hosts carrying the pathogen are more likely to come in contact. This is the big pick. So make sure you know number 4. Infected hosts carrying the pathogen are more likely to come in contact with immune individuals rather than other susceptible individuals, right? And by that concept, it would reduce the risk of other susceptible people, right? So the higher the proportion of immune individuals, the greater the protection. Okay. Why is this important? It's because it protects people that cannot be vaccinated. There's some people, right? There's some individuals in a population that they can actually get a reaction, right? And maybe some of us, maybe you personally or some people that you know could get infected, right? And have a severe shock reaction, right? An allergic reaction to a vaccine, right? Pregnant women, very difficult to get treatment in general, right? And some vaccines. Okay. And but nevertheless, right, we protect these other people by this idea of herd immunity, right? The proportion, this is number 7, not necessarily a direct process, but it is relevant. The proportion of the population who need to be immune depends on how virulent the pathogen is and how quickly it can spread and how intense the symptoms are, right? Great. If it is logical to hear, right? So if you have herd immunity, take a look at these individuals. So you have susceptible individuals in black. You have blue, mean they're immune, and you have one infected individual, right? If you see how many people are immune, you can't really, the likelihood of passing this infected individual to these individuals in black, the black person, right, is much less, right? So you're kind of protected by these blue individuals, these blue people, right? But if you don't, you're not infected. Look how many susceptible individuals, and you just have these three poor guys trying to help everyone, and they probably got infected anyways before anyone else, right? So you're much more susceptible, right? If you don't get vaccinated. So it's good to have vaccination, guys, even if some vaccines could give some side effects that I'll talk about later in the class. Okay. So for this video, this would be the last little pick that a page that I'll give to you guys. All right. This is some let me just kind of get closer here. All right. This is a graph that is showing um um Haemophilus influenza type B, right? And a meningococcal infection, right? Since the introduction of these vaccines against these particular diseases, right? So Over at the bottom, you have years, right? Since 1991, 2011, right? You have infection notification rates, right, per 100,000 individuals, right? So influenza, Haemophilus influenza vaccination program that came in and immediately introducing a vaccination. Look at the drop in the incidence rates, right? From 1990s all the way to 2011. Much lower, right? In the same situation with these type of bacterial infections, right? A meningococcal infection, right? In these particular areas of Australia, yeah. Um, Once the introduction of vaccines became available, right? You basically have a decline in cases just because of this idea of infection, right? There are some people that don't like to take vaccines, and with good reason, right? Because some vaccines have been shown to give side effects, right? And I'm going to talk about this in the class from a personal experience, but definitely, uh, um, it is a risk. It is a risk, but in general, the majority of vaccines that have been given over time have been quite successful. COVID has had a serious the vaccine, not COVID itself. The vaccine has given some severe side effects to some people, right? So, this is basically a sequence of events, a nice little summary table, right? If you get immunized either naturally or by vaccination, and if you have a critical or if you've reached a certain threshold in a population, right? And you have your vaccine, you have your antibodies that are being produced in your body, this will lower the amount of incidence rates of susceptible individuals just because the whole herd immunity get protected, right? The population gets more protected over time. Okay. So I'm going to stop this video here. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about disruption of a pathogen life cycle via medications, right? And so forth. Okay, guys.